So I think that the most impressive string of films began in 1934, and it was accomplished by Frank Capra, starting with It Happened One Night. Probably the best film, the best American film ever made, probably. Started with It Happened One Night, and we went on through titles like remarkably spectacular titles like Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, You Can't Take It With You, Lost Horizon, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Meet John Doe, It's a Wonderful Life, Arsenic and Old Lace. Hell, even the documentary, the actual propaganda documentaries that Capra made for the U.S. Army, like Prelude to War, Why We Fight, are incredible as documents of propaganda. I mean, it's incredible to see it. Frank Capra is the greatest American filmmaker that ever lived, starting in 1934. Perceptive eyes may have noticed that The Bitter Tea of General Yen came out in 1933. This is still fascinating, because we're seeing Capra try to be sophisticated here. Like covering the camera lens with a veil and like burning it with a cigarette to make Barbara Stanwyck even more irresistible, even more illuminatingly attractive, overwhelmingly so at times, but I'll get to that soon. But this is Frank Capra. This might be the first Oscar bait movie ever made, because Frank did say, I want to get an award, I want to get an Oscar, I want to make one of them important films. And you see overcomposition here, and you never see that with Capra. And Capra learned, no, absolutely not. That's completely unnecessary. In fact, trying to be incredibly remarkable is a totally unremarkable thing to do. It's kind of dehumanizing to the art. He's a populist filmmaker. And the public are a lot smarter than people think. And they're not fooled by veils of sophistication. And he learned that through The Bitter Tea of General Yen. The Bitter Tea of General Yen is also very guilty of Orientalism. Nils Aster, noted Swedish smoldering sex symbol of the day, played General Yen, donning yellow face, so to speak. And yeah, it's kind of fucked. If you can get past certain conventions of the time, Capra is really trying to tell you a story about interracial sexuality, interracial romance, interracial eroticism, and it's probably one of the very first American films, or first films ever, to actually do that. I mean, the only way they could ever possibly get away with doing it would be having a white actor portray an Asian one, with kind of today extremely exaggerated and grotesque makeup and kind of bad caricatures at times. Not that the opposite was ever even thought of, but I'm not offering an excuse, I'm offering an explanation. Like, why should you sit through this movie? Well, one reason is to see Capra's craft unfold in real time. This is really where he was able to whittle it down and perfect it into something legendary, and we would immediately, the very next year, see the results of it with It Happened One Night, the greatest American film in the world. So it's really nice seeing where that craft started, because also Capra would go on to basically invent the modern perception of America, the ethos surrounding it. And then moving on from there, it's very interesting seeing Capra handle some controversial subject matter like interracial eroticism, and it is a pretty erotic film. As Capra was always, he always had eroticism, always had romance, which separates him from American sentimentalists of even right now, who seem to be anti-romantic or at least desexualized. Capra was never like that. Capra faced sex head on, or at least always understood that sex was an elephant within a room that definitely needed to be framed. His composition, if eroticism called for it, it would be erotic. Just look at It Happened One Night. A screwball comedy without a single kiss in it, and yet, my God, it's incredibly erotic. Those characters sitting there in that beautifully, gorgeously, emotively lit hotel room on either side of the Wall of Jericho, and they're longing and they're yearning and they're... Ooh, you can feel the texture of Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert's bodies. You can feel it. It's visceral. It's so erotic. And that's also here in a large way. But what really interests me the most about this film is that Barbara Stanwyck is probably the actress who best understands Frank Capra, is the actress who best personified everything that was Capra-esque, or at least his erotic impulses, his romantic sensitivities are all personified within Barbara Stanwyck, who he worked with several times. I mean, you can say he truly learned his craft through filming and by capturing Barbara Stanwyck on film. You can really say that. The Miracle Woman and Forbidden, but I think In the Bitter Tea of General Yen, that's really where his love letter is to the only person who could ever even be considered something close to a muse for Frank Capra, which I'm not entirely sure he ever truly had outside of maybe Lady Liberty. The way he is so clearly infatuated and in love with Barbara Stanwyck is so pure and so revealing of something ultra sensitive about Frank Capra that we don't necessarily see in other works, because he's a master in other works, and he doesn't really have any vulnerabilities because he has perfected the craft. There are no weak spots. The fortress of Frank Capra's craft after 1934 cannot be penetrated. But before that, we can see a vulnerable young director, an aching young man filming goddesses, filming extraordinarily beautiful men and women, and amplifying the erotic into something eternally romantic. And we can see him kind of get weak in the knees, feeling so desperate for Barbara Stanwyck. He's feeling desperate for Barbara Stanwyck in The Bitter Tea of General Yen, and that's why I think it's interesting. That's why I think it's a fascinating film. Because the way Capra sees her and the care that he went through to film her in ways that are extraordinarily beautiful, but also very vulnerable, not for Barbara, but for Capra, I think is incredibly valuable as a fan of Capra and as a fan of American filmmaking. Capra was in love with Barbara Stanwyck, and it's incredible seeing it happen. Here's the result of his love is him trying to immortalize her in an award-winning film that never actually won anything, and most people kind of overlook it because it's not a great film by any means, especially watching it now in today's world. It's really hard to get over the Orientalism. It's really hard to get over the blatant racism, the caricatures in the film of Asian personalities. It's bad. It's hard to grapple with, even if it is kind of even talking about like a romance of opposing theologies, a romance of different races, a romance of completely different sorts of people. It can't get past the racism of the piece. It becomes a little difficult. What's curious, though, is that Capra certainly did not think he was being problematic or racist, and I probably don't think he was either. If you ask me, it was the conventions of the time. It's just that now that's really not forgivable in a whole lot of different ways for a whole lot of different reasons. But there's this one part where Barbara Stanwyck's character is having a nightmare, and it's like her unconscious battling against the sexual attractions that she feels for General Yen, and she has a nightmare of General Yen beating through her door, and then in her nightmare version of him is that awful racist caricature with like long fingernails. I'm not going to describe what it. I mean, you know what it is. You know, it's so hyper exaggerated. It is so incredibly racist that it's absolutely cartoonish in its bigotry, and this is deliberate because she's working through an American prejudice or a Western prejudice, and she's seeing in her nightmare the caricature, the awful, vile, racist caricature that Western women and Western men have of Asians, and she's seeing that, and she's having to face that and confront that and realize that it is untruthful, that it's absolutely unreal, that there's a part of her that is bigoted that she has to break out of. But what makes it so erotic is that Capra doesn't necessarily focus on like that bigoted part of her that needs to move past it. It's more so like a repressed erotic part of her that has woken up because General Yen has stirred something so impulsive, so tender, and so sexual within her. That's why it gets really interesting. It's not a great movie. It's hardly a good movie, but it is a fascinating one nonetheless, because Frank Capra loved Barbara Stanwyck more than maybe any director ever loved any other actress. And for 1933, it is trying to say a lot of complicated things about love and race and God and country as well. About allegiance and also about eroticism and suicide. It's trying to say a lot of different things. It's just Capra didn't exactly know how to say them yet, but he knew he had something hugely important to say within film. And the very next year, he would figure out how to do it. And by the end of the decade, by Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, he will have invented an entire country's persona. He would have invented America on screen. And it's wild to go from Bitter Tea of General Yen to something like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Oh my God, in just 6 short years, 5 or 6 years, how do you do that? Well, I obviously don't know. I'm not a genius, I'm not a prodigy. But Frank Capra is all of those things and more. He astounds me.